I got home to a scene that could have been straight out of a crime drama, though without the flashing lights or the detectives. Instead, it was the kind of crime that makes your blood boil with frustration. My koi pond, my peaceful retreat, was almost drained dry, the last bit of water swirling sadly as a thick hose sucked it away. My koi flopped helplessly in the mud, their bright colors dimmed by the muck. And there she was, standing over them, clipboard in hand. Karen, dressed in her signature beige power suit, the one that screamed, "I've got nothing better to do than ruin your day." She wore a smug look as she tapped her pen against her clipboard, inspecting the situation like some villainous queen surveying her kingdom. The landscapers beside her, all wearing the company's approved uniforms, barely acknowledged my presence as they continued draining the pond. "Oh good, you're home," Karen cooed, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We're just finishing up." I stood there, speechless at first, my brain struggling to comprehend the chaos before me. The pond, the fish, the wrecked ecosystem. What kind of person does this? My hands clenched into fists as I took a step forward. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I meant it to be, but I couldn't hold back. Karen raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Oh dear, I thought you got the notice. We're reallocating water resources for the HOA's landscaping project. Your pond water is simply being repurposed for the greater good." I blinked, stunned. She said it like it was no big deal, like she wasn't actively killing my koi and ruining my property, as if none of this was totally insane. "The greater good," I repeated, my voice cracking. "This is my private property, Karen. You can't just—" "Oh, but I can," she interrupted, flipping through the pages of her clipboard. "See, according to Section 14B of the HOA Charter, water usage that exceeds the community standard is subject to redistribution for communal projects. And your little fish pond here? It's a luxury, not a necessity." She smiled like she'd just won a legal battle, like she was expecting me to thank her. My eye twitched. "They're living creatures," I said, pointing at the struggling koi. "You're literally killing them." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be dramatic. They'll be fine. Just refill it later." She turned to one of the landscapers. "Make sure the remaining water is fully drained before we move on to the next phase." "The next phase?" I snapped. "What the hell is the next phase?" Karen gave me a condescending smile. "Oh, just a few adjustments to make sure our community's aesthetics stay cohesive. We may need to reshape your yard to better blend with the HOA's landscape design." My blood pressure shot up. "You mean bulldoze it?" She waved me off. "Oh, don't be so negative." I took a deep breath. I wasn't one to lose my cool easily, but this was pushing it. I'd put so much time and effort into making this pond my little sanctuary, and now it was being drained again, all because Karen had some weird god complex over this neighborhood. And no, this wasn't the first time. This wasn't the first time. At first, I thought it was just a mistake, maybe a simple misunderstanding. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, Karen had a new reason. Water conservation, community enhancement, aesthetic harmony. And each time, I was left to refill the damn thing at my own cost. But this? Watching my fish fight for air, watching this smug control freak dictate what I could and couldn't do with my own property? That was it. Enough was enough. "You know what?" I said, my voice eerily calm. "Fine." Karen's smile faltered just a bit. "Fine." I nodded. "Fine. Take your water." Her face changed, confused by my sudden compliance. But I was already turning away, heading back to my house. I had a plan. A dangerous, beautiful plan. If Karen wanted to drain my pond, I'd let her. I'd let her take every last drop. And then, I'd make sure she regretted it. Because next time, that water wasn't going to be clear. Oh no, it was going to be a bright, horrifying, neon green. And I was going to watch her precious HOA empire fall apart right in front of her. I spent the rest of the day researching safe dyes for ponds, something that would look dramatic but wouldn't hurt the environment. It didn't take long to find the perfect solution, a super concentrated, high-visibility pond dye used in large water features. The kind that would turn my pond into a glowing, otherworldly green nightmare. The best part? It was completely safe for my fish. The second best part? It would stain everything it touched for weeks. That night, under the cover of darkness, I carefully poured the dye into the newly refilled pond. The water swirled, shifting from crystal blue to a hideous, radioactive green. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie, like a toxic spill that would have the EPA freaking out. It was perfect. And then, I waited. The next morning, like clockwork, the HOA landscapers showed up. Karen, in her usual perfect beige suit, stood proudly at the edge of my yard, watching as the workers hooked up the hose and started draining my pond. She didn't even glance at me as I stood on my porch, arms crossed, sipping my coffee. I didn't need to stop her. I didn't need to yell or argue. Because the moment the first wave of bright green water flowed out of the hose and into the pristine HOA flower beds, the screaming started. Karen's shriek was deafening. What the hell is happening? I bit my lip to keep from laughing as she scrambled back, staring in horror as the neon green water flooded the manicured bushes, soaked into the grass, staining everything it touched. The landscapers froze, clearly baffled. One of them even dropped the hose and stepped back like he'd just seen a chemical spill. Karen spun around, her face flushed with anger. What did you do? I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. Oh, I said, my voice dripping with fake innocence. Didn't you get the notice? My pond is part of an experimental eco-friendly algae treatment. It's perfectly safe. I motioned toward the now glowing flower beds. It's just a little greener than expected. Karen's eye twitched. You, she sputtered, but she couldn't finish her sentence, too busy watching the scene unfold. Neighbors had started gathering, murmuring in confusion. Phones were out, cameras flashing as people snapped pictures of the once pristine community landscaping now looking like something out of a nuclear disaster. And the best part? The dye wasn't going anywhere. It would take weeks, maybe longer, for the color to fade. Karen had just managed to turn her precious HOA landscaping project into a public laughingstock, and I had the front row seat. Karen stood at the center of the chaos, her perfect world unraveling before her eyes. The bright green water had soaked deep into the HOA landscaping, staining everything in its path. The once perfect flower beds now looked like they'd been soaked in toxic waste. The lush, carefully trimmed grass now glowed with an eerie, unnatural hue. The shrubs, which had been Karen's pride, stood out in a grotesque green. She kept shaking her head, her hands twitching as if she could reverse the disaster with just her willpower. The landscapers stood frozen, hoses dropped to the ground, their faces alternating between confusion and terror. One kicked at the sod, helpless as the water refused to drain. A murmur spread through the growing crowd of neighbors, most drawn in by the sight of what looked like a radioactive spill in the middle of the neighborhood. Karen suddenly spun toward me, her face twisted in fury. You did this. Her voice cracked, and her composure seemed to be hanging by a thread. I took another slow sip of my coffee, savoring every second. Did what, Karen? I mean, if you drained my pond, then technically, you did this. You're the one who redistributed the water. I gestured toward the vibrant green flower beds with a casual shrug. Looks like the landscaping got a little extra personality. Her nostrils flared. She stomped toward me, her beige heels squelching in the freshly dyed grass, which only made this moment sweeter. With every step, she seemed to realize her shoes were absorbing the color. The expensive material was now streaked with bright green, and with each step, she left glowing footprints behind. You poisoned the neighborhood, she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at me. You think this is funny? This is vandalism. I'll have you removed from this community. I raised an eyebrow, feigning concern. Poison? Oh no, Karen. It's completely safe. Just a little pond dye. It'll fade, eventually. The twitch in her eye told me she wasn't interested in waiting for eventually. She turned sharply, barking orders at the landscapers to clean it up immediately. The poor guys just stood there, staring at each other, clearly having no idea how to remove something that had already soaked deep into the soil. One muttered something about dilution, but that only made things worse. They tried flushing the area with more water, but all it did was spread the green stain further, creating streaks across the walkways and driveways. A few neighbors stifled laughs. Someone took a video. Another snapped a picture. Whispers grew louder, people talking about what a disaster this was. The HOA's precious landscaping was now a neighborhood joke, and Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the block, was the one who had unwittingly caused it. Her panic escalated quickly. She grabbed her phone, pacing in circles as she called someone, her voice shifting from angry orders to desperate pleading. She demanded immediate cleanup, insisted this was a crisis, and at one point, even asked if the city could send out environmental specialists. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop from laughing. She was treating harmless pond dye like it was a full-blown toxic spill. More neighbors gathered, some chuckling, others just staring at the absurdity. One man whistled low under his breath and muttered, "Looks like a damn alien invasion." A woman nearby nodded, snapping a picture with her phone. "This is going on the neighborhood Facebook page," she whispered to her husband, who barely contained his grin. Karen must have overheard because she spun around, her face as red as a tomato. "No one posts anything," she screamed. "This is not funny. This is a crime." The man shrugged. "Looks like you did it to yourself, Karen." She turned an even deeper shade of red. I could almost see the steam coming from her ears. She turned to me again, pointing her finger in my direction. "I am reporting this. To the HOA. To the city. To the—" I raised a hand, cutting her off. "Go ahead, Karen. Call whoever you want. But I hope you're ready to explain why you've been illegally draining a private pond and using the water for unauthorized landscaping projects." Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. That was the exact moment I saw it. The moment when reality started to hit her. The moment she realized she had made a huge, catastrophic mistake. The HOA had spent thousands on this landscaping project. They had drained my pond, without my consent, for a community beautification effort. And now, that effort had turned into a neon green nightmare that everyone in the neighborhood was laughing about. Not only that, but people were starting to question her authority. They were whispering about whether this was even legal. People were doubting her. And for Karen, that was the real disaster. She turned back to the landscapers, her voice shaking. "Fix this. Right now." One of them sighed. "Ma'am, we don't have a way to fix this. The dye needs to break down naturally. It could take weeks." Karen let out a sound somewhere between a strangled gasp and an outraged whimper. "That is unacceptable." I leaned against my porch railing, enjoying the show. I mean, you could always dig up all the stained grass and replant everything. Of course, that would be pretty expensive. But hey, isn't that what the HOA budget is for? Her head snapped toward me, her lips pressed tightly together in a thin, furious line. And that's when I saw it. That tiny flicker of fear in her eyes. She was putting it all together. If this mess drained the HOA's budget, people would blame her. And they already were. In a neighborhood where power meant everything, Karen was starting to realize she was losing hers. She turned abruptly and stormed off, furiously typing into her phone. Probably trying to do damage control. Probably already cooking up some ridiculous excuse for why none of this was her fault. But it was too late. The pictures had been taken. The videos were already spreading. The neighbors were already laughing, already talking, already questioning. I finished my coffee with a satisfied sigh. The trap had been set. The damage had been done. And this was just the beginning. Karen's panic didn't fade after the landscapers left. In fact, it only got worse. Over the next few days, she went into full damage control mode, trying to twist the disaster into something she could somehow blame on me. She sent out HOA-wide emails filled with nonsense about an unauthorized water contamination event and even held an emergency meeting to discuss corrective actions. I skimmed through the emails while sitting by my freshly refilled pond, watching my koi glide peacefully through their reclaimed home. I could almost feel the desperation in Karen's words. It didn't take long for the fallout to spread. The once pristine HOA landscaping had become a joke throughout the neighborhood, and Karen's tight grip on the community was slipping. People had questions. A lot of them. Why was she draining private property for landscaping? How much of the HOA budget had she blown on this failed project? More importantly, who gave the green light for this whole thing? As more people started talking, more stories came out. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had felt the sting of Karen's overreach. One neighbor came forward about an incident where Karen fined them for having an unapproved flower color. Another shared how Karen had tried to enforce a rule about the exact shade of beige everyone's house had to be painted. The more people talked, the worse it got. Then came the best part. The city got involved. Someone forwarded one of Karen's frantic calls to a city official who wasn't thrilled to be dragged into what was essentially a petty neighborhood squabble. A representative showed up at the next HOA meeting, not to support Karen, but to investigate. The moment he walked in, Karen's face went from smug confidence to barely contained panic. I got there just in time to grab a front row seat. The community center was packed, filled with more neighbors than I'd ever seen at one of these meetings. Normally, HOA meetings were boring affairs, with Karen droning on about lawn violations and mailbox height regulations. But tonight, the air was buzzing with excitement. People wanted answers, and Karen looked like she wanted to be anywhere but there. She started the meeting like usual, trying to hold on to control. She cleared her throat and forced a tight smile, acting like everything was fine. She went on about how the situation was being handled and how steps were being taken to fix the landscaping. But the moment she mentioned an upcoming mandatory neighborhood fee hike to cover the costs, the room erupted. Someone from the back shouted, "You want us to pay for your mistake?" Another voice added, "Why did you even drain private property in the first place?" Karen's smile twitched, her grip tightening on the podium. Now, she said, her voice shaky. This was a necessary effort to maintain the integrity of our community's appearance. The city representative, a no-nonsense guy in a gray suit, leaned forward. "Ms. Peterson, can you clarify under what legal authority you were draining water from a privately owned pond for HOA landscaping?" Karen froze. She opened her mouth, then shut it, then tried again. "The HOA has broad discretion under the community charter, too." The man raised a hand, cutting her off. "That's not what I asked. I asked for the specific legal authority." Silence. The room went completely still. Karen shifted on her feet, her eyes darting around, looking for someone to back her up. But no one spoke, not even the usual HOA loyalists who usually nodded along to whatever she said. Even they knew she was cornered. The city official nodded, almost as if he expected this. "That's what I thought. As of now, the city is launching a formal review of the HOA's actions regarding the unauthorized water use and any potential violations of private property rights." Karen's face drained of color. "That's not necessary," she said quickly. "This is being handled internally." The man didn't even acknowledge her words. He turned to the audience. "If anyone has had similar issues with HOA overreach, you're encouraged to submit complaints to my office." As soon as he said that, several hands shot up. Karen's jaw clenched so tight, I thought her teeth might break. She was losing control, and she knew it. But she wasn't done fighting yet. She turned to me, making a last-ditch attempt to shift the blame. This man deliberately tampered with the water. He used illegal substances to contaminate. The city official cut her off again. "We tested the water. It was non-toxic, legally obtained, and entirely within his rights to use on his own property. Your HOA, however, has no right to redistribute private water sources for public use." Karen's mouth snapped shut. She looked trapped, like a cornered animal trying to figure out how to escape. But there was no way out. Then came the final blow. One of the HOA board members, a woman who had always seemed uncomfortable with Karen's antics, cleared her throat. "I think it's time we put something to a vote." Karen whipped her head around. "We are not voting on anything." But the murmurs in the crowd told a different story. The woman raised her voice. "I propose a vote of no confidence in Karen Peterson as HOA president." Karen's eyes widened. "You can't." "Yes, we can," the woman interrupted. "And we should." The murmurs grew louder, turning into nods, then into agreement. Someone from the back said, "About damn time." Another voice added, "She's been out of control for years." A man near the front, a longtime resident, sighed. I second the motion. It all unraveled for Karen in that moment. She tried to fight it, tried to argue, tried to hold on to the power she had once ruled with such an iron fist. But she had lost the room. The vote was taken, and the results were quick and merciless. Karen was officially ousted. She sat there, stunned, as the board carried on without her. Discussions started about undoing some of the ridiculous rules she had put in place. People were already talking about new leadership, making sure no one would ever again have the kind of unchecked power she had. And just like that, Karen's reign was over. As the meeting ended, people came up to me, shaking my hand, laughing about how absurd the whole thing had been. Someone even joked about putting in a community koi pond in my honor. I just smiled, watching Karen as she sat rigid in her chair, her fists clenched, staring into space. She didn't look like a tyrant anymore. She just looked lost. As I walked home that night, the air felt lighter. The HOA still existed, sure, but it no longer had a dictator in charge. My pond was safe. My fish were safe. And best of all, Karen? She was history. I stood by my pond, watching the water ripple under the moonlight. I had won, and for the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I finally felt like I could breathe. The koi swam lazily beneath the surface, blissfully unaware of the battle that had been fought over their home. I smiled, tossing a few food pellets into the water. Peace at last, and no one would ever dare touch my pond again.